My identical twin has been pretending to be me for 6 months. I just found out why. The security footage showed me walking into my office building at 11:43 p.m. last Thursday. I watched myself swipe my badge, wave at the night guard, and take the elevator to the 7th floor, where I work as a senior accountant. The problem was simple and impossible. I was in Seattle that entire week for my best friend's wedding. I hadn't been anywhere near Boston, let alone my office building. But there I was on the screen, clear as day, wearing my gray Nike jacket and my usual Thursday outfit, moving with my walk, my mannerisms, even scratching my neck the way I do when I'm tired. Quote. The head of security, Dennis Crawford, said carefully. Quote. 1. I stared at the frozen frame, at my own face looking directly into the camera, and felt reality tilt sideways. That wasn't me, but it was absolutely, undeniably me. I'd been working at Fortis Financial Group for 3 years, building a solid reputation as a detail-oriented accountant who never missed deadlines and caught discrepancies others overlooked. At 32, I had a comfortable life, a job I was good at, a girlfriend I loved, and enough savings to start thinking about buying a house. My identical twin brother, Julian, lived in New York working in sales for a tech startup. We looked exactly alike, down to the small scar above our left eyebrow from a childhood bike accident, but we'd carved out separate lives after college. We talked maybe once a month, saw each other at holidays, maintained the comfortable distance that adult siblings often do. I had no reason to suspect him of anything. Why would I? We weren't competing for the same job, the same girl, the same life. Or so I thought. The meeting in the security office happened on a Monday morning, 3 days after I'd returned from Seattle. Dennis Crawford was a former police officer with 23 years of experience, and he sat across from me with the kind of professional concern that made my stomach knot. Beside him was my supervisor, Catherine Okonkwo, who'd always been fair but was now looking at me like I was a stranger. Quote. 2. Dennis said, sliding a folder across the table. Quote. I opened the folder to find still images. Me at the server room door, me sitting at a terminal, me copying files onto a flash drive. Except it wasn't me. I wasn't here for any of these dates, I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. Catherine leaned forward, her expression a mix of disappointment and confusion. Ethan, we pulled the access logs. Your badge was used. The security system logged your fingerprint at the biometric scanner. How do you explain that? I couldn't. My brain was moving too slowly, trying to process information that didn't make sense. Someone who looked exactly like me had been entering my workplace after hours, accessing secure systems, copying confidential files. Someone with my badge, my fingerprints. The only person who fit that description was Julian. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Julian lived in New York. Julian had his own career, his own life. What possible reason would he have to impersonate me at my workplace? Quote 6. Dennis continued. Quote 7. I felt my hands start to shake. Quote. I said, pulling out my phone. I called Julian right there in the security office, putting it on speaker when they nodded permission. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail. I tried a 3rd time, and this time he picked up. Quote 9. His voice came through, casual and unconcerned. Quote 10. My mouth was dry. Quote 11. A pause. Quote 12. I looked at the security footage frozen on the monitor, at my own face staring back at me. Quote 13. Another pause, longer this time. Quote 14. We agreed, and I hung up, my mind racing. Something was very wrong, and every instinct I had was screaming that my brother was at the center of it. The company put me on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. Catherine apologized, saying it was protocol, but her eyes held doubt now. She wasn't sure if she believed my denials, and honestly, how could she? The evidence was overwhelming. I was guilty according to every objective measure except the most important one. I hadn't actually done it. I drove home in a fog, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. My girlfriend, Claire Huang, was at our apartment when I got there. She was a pediatric nurse who worked the night shift, and she was usually asleep during the day, but today she was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and an expression on her face I couldn't quite read. "We need to talk," she said as soon as I walked in. My stomach dropped further, which I hadn't thought was possible. She closed her laptop slowly, deliberately. She turned the screen toward me, showing me her email inbox. Quote 18. I stared at the screen, my brain struggling to process yet another impossibility. Quote 19. She pulled up her banking app, showing me her checking account. 3 large withdrawals over the past month, totaling almost $15,000. Her voice cracked. The pieces started clicking together with sickening clarity. Quote 22. I asked urgently. Quote 23. She pulled up the transaction history. The dates aligned with the late-night office visits. Whoever was impersonating me was also impersonating Claire. But how was that possible? She didn't have an identical twin. Unless... Claire, has anyone had access to your apartment? To your things? Any weird visits? Anything out of the ordinary? She thought for a moment. Julian was here about 2 months ago. He said he was in Boston for work and asked if he could crash on our couch for a night. You were working late, remember? We had takeout, talked for a while. He seemed normal. My blood ran cold. Julian had been alone with Claire, in our apartment, with access to her keys, her wallet, her entire life. We need to file a police report, I said. Right now. Both of us. The Boston Police Department's fraud division was in a gray building downtown that smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent lighting. Detective Raymond Osei was the officer assigned to our case, a man in his early 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the weary expression of someone who'd seen every kind of human depravity. He listened to our story without interrupting, taking notes in neat handwriting on a yellow legal pad. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied us both carefully. So you're saying your identical twin brother has been impersonating you to access your workplace after hours, and somehow also impersonating your girlfriend to steal from her accounts? Put that way, it sounded insane. But Detective Osei didn't look skeptical. He looked concerned. He said slowly, I didn't have an answer. Julian and I weren't close, but we weren't enemies either. We'd never competed for the same things, never had the kind of rivalry that turned toxic. He'd been successful in his own right, making good money in tech sales. What could he possibly gain from destroying my life? I'm meeting him tonight, I said. In Providence at 6 p.m., maybe I can get him to explain. Detective Osei frowned. I'd advise against confronting him directly. If he's engaged in criminal activity, approaching him could be dangerous. But I needed answers, and I needed them now. We agreed to a compromise. I'd wear a wire, record the conversation, and 2 plainclothes officers would be in the diner as backup. Detective Osei gave me his card and told me to call him immediately after the meeting, no matter what happened. The hours until 6 p.m. crawled by with agonizing slowness. Claire and I sat in our apartment going through everything, trying to understand when and how Julian had gained access to our lives. She found photos on her phone she didn't remember taking, selfies that looked slightly wrong, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. This is from that Saturday I told you I went shopping with my sister, she said, her voice shaking. But I didn't go shopping. I called my sister. She said I canceled last minute because of a migraine. Except I don't remember having a migraine. I remember shopping. Her face went pale. Ethan, I think I've been losing time. Whole chunks of days where I think I was doing one thing, but apparently I was doing something else. The implications were horrifying. If someone had been drugging Claire, manipulating her memory, that was a whole different level of criminal behavior. At 5:15 p.m., I drove toward Providence with a recording device hidden under my shirt, courtesy of Detective Osei's team. The wire was small, professional, and I could barely feel it, but I was hyper-aware of its presence. The diner was a classic chrome and red vinyl place called the Silver Skillet, the kind of roadside stop that looked unchanged since the 1950s. I arrived early and took a booth near the back where I could see the entrance. 2 plainclothes officers, Detective Osei had introduced them as Officers Brian Liu and Angela Kowalski, were already there, sitting separately, pretending to read newspapers and drink coffee. At 6:04 p.m., Julian walked in. He looked exactly like me, which shouldn't have been surprising, but somehow still was. Same height, same build, same face. He was wearing a black North Face jacket and jeans, and he smiled when he saw me, that familiar half-smile we'd both inherited from our father. Quote, 37. He said, sliding into the booth across from me. Quote, 38. Up close, I could see subtle differences I'd never noticed before. His eyes looked tired, ringed with dark circles. There was a tension in his jaw that seemed new. He looked like me, but he also looked wrong, like a copy that was slightly off-register. I got put on leave today, I said, watching his face carefully. From work. They have security footage of me entering the building at night, accessing confidential files. Except I wasn't there. I paused. It was you, wasn't it? For just a second, I saw something flicker across his face. Panic, maybe, or calculation, before his expression settled into confusion. What? Ethan, that's crazy. How would I even get into your building? His act was good. I'd give him that. The waitress came by and we ordered coffee neither of us wanted, buying time. When she left, Julian leaned forward, lowering his voice. I cut him off. I watched him carefully. His face went blank. That calculated neutrality that I now recognized as his tell. He stood up suddenly. I said quietly. Quote 50. He stayed standing for a long moment, and I saw the internal debate playing out behind his eyes. Then, slowly, he sat back down. When he spoke again, his voice was different, harder, colder, stripped of pretense. He said. I stared at him, genuinely shocked. Quote 53. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Quote 54. The casual cruelty of it stunned me into silence. Quote 55. My hands were shaking under the table, but I kept my voice steady, remembering the wire, making sure everything was being recorded. Quote 56. Julian smiled, and it was like looking in a mirror at someone I didn't recognize. You'd be amazed what you can accomplish with the right connections. There's a surgeon in Prague who specializes in facial modifications for people in witness protection programs. For the right price, he can make temporary changes, subtle things, prosthetics, makeup techniques, voice coaching. I found someone who looks similar to Claire, hired her, had her modified to match exactly. She's been playing the part when needed, making the withdrawals, establishing patterns. Claire's been so confused, thinking she's losing her memory. It's almost funny. The calculated nature of it, the premeditation, the absolute absence of guilt. I was talking to a stranger who happened to share my DNA. The police are here, I said quietly. I'm wearing a wire. Everything you just said was recorded. I watched the color drain from his face as he glanced around the diner, finally noticing the plainclothes officers who were now standing, moving toward our booth. Julian's expression cycled through shock, rage, and finally, resignation. He said bitterly. Detective Osi entered the diner then with 2 uniformed officers, and the scene played out with surreal efficiency. They read Julian his rights, while other patrons stared and whispered. He didn't resist, didn't struggle, just stood there with his hands being cuffed behind his back, looking at me with something between hatred and grudging respect. Quote 62. He said, as they led him toward the exit. Quote 63. The door closed behind them, and I sat alone in the booth, my coffee going cold, trying to process what had just happened. Detective Osei came back inside and sat across from me, in the seat Julian had just vacated. He said. He paused. Quote 66. The scope of what Julian had orchestrated was staggering. This wasn't a spontaneous crime of opportunity. This was planned, methodical, and involved multiple co-conspirators across international borders. How long will it take to clear my name? I asked. With my company? With Claire's bank? Detective Osei was honest with me. It'll take time. We'll send letters to your employer and the bank explaining the investigation, but clearing your record completely will require closing the case, which could take months. In the meantime, I'd recommend hiring a lawyer to protect your interests. He handed me a business card for a defense attorney named Diana Phelps, who specialized in fraud cases. She's good. She'll make sure the companies don't try to hold you liable for your brother's actions. The next few weeks were a bureaucratic nightmare of statements, depositions, and legal paperwork. Diana Phelps systematically dismantled any attempt to hold me accountable for Julian's crimes. She got subpoenas for security footage, phone records proving I was in Seattle during the break-ins, and credit card statements showing purchases made simultaneously in different cities. Claire's bank was more difficult, having frozen her accounts while investigating. Diana filed motions, escalating to corporate headquarters, threatening lawsuits. 3 weeks after Julian's arrest, Claire got a formal apology and a check for $15,000 plus interest. But the money didn't undo the violation. She started seeing Dr. Nicole Fraser, who specialized in identity theft trauma. My company took longer to come around. Even with Detective Osie's letters and Diana's legal threats, there was institutional paranoia about the security breach. Catherine called me for an off-the-record conversation at a coffee shop near the office. She looked exhausted. "Ethan, I believe you," she said. "The evidence is clear, your brother confessed, and I feel terrible about what you've been through. But the board is nervous. We had a major security incident. Client data was compromised, and shareholders are asking questions." She hesitated. "They're offering you a severance package, 6 months' salary, full benefits continuation, and a neutral reference. They want to avoid litigation." I felt anger rise in my chest. They want to pay me to go away, to pretend I'm the problem rather than admit their security systems were vulnerable. She didn't deny it. Quote 75. I took the severance. Diana advised against it, saying we could get more, but I was exhausted from fighting. I'd been in survival mode for weeks, and the thought of months or years of litigation made me sick. I signed the papers, took the money, and walked away from Fortis Financial Group. It felt like losing, but it also felt like freedom. Julian's case moved through the legal system with remarkable speed for the justice system. The prosecution had his recorded confession, documentary evidence of the fraud, and testimony from me, Claire, and multiple expert witnesses. His lawyer, a public defender named Kevin Ortega, tried to argue diminished capacity, claiming Julian had experienced a psychological break due to childhood trauma and sibling rivalry. It didn't work. The judge, Honorable Miriam Chen. Wait, I need to avoid that name. The judge, Honorable Miriam Davenport, was unimpressed by the psychological defense. The defendant engaged in months of premeditation, recruited accomplices, and demonstrated clear understanding of right and wrong, she said from the bench. This was not a crime of passion or mental illness. This was calculated identity theft and fraud executed with precision and malice. Julian pleaded guilty to avoid trial, accepting a deal that gave him 8 years in federal prison for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The sentencing hearing was brief and brutal. I sat in the courtroom gallery next to Claire, watching my identical twin stand before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, looking smaller somehow, diminished. When given the opportunity to make a statement, he turned and looked directly at me. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time, he sounded genuine. "I'm sorry for what I did to you, to Claire, to everyone. I let jealousy poison me until I couldn't see anything else. You didn't deserve this." The judge sentenced him immediately after, and federal marshals led him away. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, no closure. Just exhaustion and a strange grief for the brother I'd thought I'd known but apparently never had. The international investigation uncovered Sofia Volkov, a struggling actress from New Jersey, who'd accepted $20,000 from Julian to impersonate Claire. The surgeon in Prague, Dr. Karol Novotny, was already under Interpol investigation. Sofia's modifications were high-end prosthetics and makeup, along with voice coaching and behavioral mimicry training. She'd spent weeks studying videos of Claire, learning her mannerisms and speech patterns. Detective Osie showed me footage of Sofia pretending to be Claire at a bank. The resemblance was uncanny. Sofia was arrested and immediately cooperated, providing details about Julian's plan in exchange for a reduced sentence. He'd been planning this for over a year, installing keyloggers on my laptop during Christmas, stealing passwords, cloning my security badge, even taking molds of my fingerprints using dental putty while I slept on his couch. The level of premeditation was staggering. Our parents took the news about Julian's arrest and conviction hard. My mother, Patricia, called me sobbing after the sentencing. "How did I not see this?" she kept asking. "How did I raise one son who's decent and another who's capable of this?" I didn't have answers for her. My father, Leonard, retreated into angry silence, the way he always had when emotions got too complex. They'd both testified at Julian's sentencing hearing, begging for leniency, describing the kind boy they'd raised. But the kind boy they remembered and the calculating criminal in the courtroom were two different people. Or maybe they'd always been the same person and we'd just been seeing what we wanted to see. Family dinners became impossible. Every time I sat across from my mother, I could see her looking at me and wondering if she was really seeing me or some echo of Julian. "I keep thinking he'll show up," she admitted, "that I'll answer the door and he'll be standing there, and I won't know which son I'm looking at." Claire and I tried to rebuild normalcy, but the foundation had cracks now. She started having panic attacks when I came home from job interviews, irrationally afraid that I wasn't really me, that Julian had somehow escaped prison and taken my place again. Dr. Fraser said it was trauma response, that her sense of reality had been violated so profoundly that her brain couldn't trust perception anymore. "It's called Capgras delusion, Doctor," Fraser explained during a session Claire invited me to attend. "The belief that someone close to you has been replaced by an imposter. It's usually associated with neurological damage, but it can be psychologically induced by trauma. Claire's brain is trying to protect her from being fooled again." The irony wasn't lost on me. Julian's impersonation had been so complete that now the real me triggered the same fear as the fake me had. Claire started asking me questions only I would know the answers to. The name of my childhood dog, the story of our first kiss, the weird dream I'd told her about. It broke my heart every time. 6 months after Julian's sentencing, I finally got a new job. Not in accounting. I couldn't face going back to that world where my face on security footage could mean anything. Instead, I took a position at a cybersecurity firm called Secure ID Solutions, advising companies on identity verification systems and fraud prevention. The irony wasn't lost on my new boss, Richard Alvarez, who hired me specifically because of my experience. "You've lived through the nightmare scenario every company fears," he said during the interview. "You understand identity fraud from the victim's perspective. That's invaluable." The work was interesting, and being paid to help prevent what had happened to me felt like turning trauma into purpose. But I still flinched every time I saw my reflection in an unexpected mirror, still wondered if the person looking back was really me. Claire and I lasted another 3 months before she needed space. "It's not your fault," she said, tears streaming. "But every time I look at you, I'm reminded of the worst experience of my life. It's not fair to you, and it's not healthy for me." She moved out the following week. We agreed to take a break, but we both knew what that meant. Julian had stolen the trust that relationships are built on. I started therapy with Dr. Howard Kim, who specialized in identity trauma. He had me do exercises, recording myself talking and playing it back, taking selfies at different angles, keeping detailed journals. "Your brother attacked your sense of self," Dr. Kim explained. "You're rebuilding the fundamental knowledge that you are a continuous, consistent person." The sessions helped, slowly. A year after the sentencing, I received a letter from Julian. It was forwarded through his prison's mail system, his handwriting cramped and small on lined paper. It began. I read the letter 3 times, sitting in my apartment with my hands shaking. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to reject his apology as too little and too late. But another part recognized the truth in his words, the genuine self-awareness that might be the first step toward actual change. I didn't write back. I wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that. But I kept the letter in a drawer, a strange artifact of the brother I'd lost and the brother who'd never really existed. Dr. Kim said that was healthy, that I didn't owe Julian forgiveness, but could acknowledge his humanity without absolving his crimes. "He's both things, Doctor," Kim said. "The brother you grew up with and the criminal who tried to destroy you. People contain multitudes, and sometimes those multitudes contradict each other violently." 2 years after everything started, I was rebuilding. I had a good job, a new apartment in Cambridge, and I'd started dating Rebecca Torres, a veterinary surgeon who knew everything about Julian. She'd listened on our 3rd date and said, "That's horrific, but it doesn't define you unless you let it." We took things slow, building trust incrementally. My parents and I repaired our relationship, though it would never be what it was. My mother still mourned the son she'd lost to prison. My father started therapy, confronting his role in creating the competitive dynamic between Julian and me. Claire reached out after 18 months. We met for coffee, both changed by the experience. She'd left nursing temporarily, getting a master's in social work to counsel trauma survivors. We didn't get back together, but we found peace. Julian's prison sentence continued without incident. He enrolled in vocational training programs, got his GED, participated in therapy groups. The prison reports I received through the victim notification system showed a man trying to rehabilitate himself, though I remained skeptical. People don't change that easily, that completely. But Dr. Kim pointed out that I didn't need to believe in Julian's redemption to continue my own healing. His journey and your journey are separate now, he said. You can acknowledge his efforts while maintaining boundaries. Growth isn't forgiveness, and forgiveness isn't reconciliation. They're all different things. I appreciated that framework. It gave me permission to hope Julian was becoming better while accepting I might never trust him again. My work at Secure ID Solutions evolved into something meaningful. I developed a new biometric verification system that used behavioral patterns rather than just fingerprints or facial recognition. The idea was simple. People move through digital spaces in unique ways, with distinctive patterns of mouse movement, typing rhythm, navigation choices. Even identical twins would have different behavioral signatures. I called it the Doppelganger Protocol, and it was specifically designed to prevent the kind of impersonation Julian had executed. The technology got attention from major corporations and government agencies. I gave presentations at security conferences, telling my story as a cautionary tale while demonstrating the solution. It felt like taking my trauma and forging it into armor for others. Rebecca and I moved in together after a year of dating. It was a leap of faith for both of us. Her previous relationship had ended in betrayal too, though less dramatically than mine. We built our home carefully, with explicit conversations about boundaries and trust. She installed a fingerprint scanner on our apartment door as a housewarming present, which made us both laugh and cry. No unwanted twins allowed, she joked, and I appreciated her ability to find humor in horror. We created rituals of authenticity. Friday night dinners where we shared our worst moments of the week, Sunday morning debriefs where we checked in on our emotional states, random Tuesday questions where we asked each other things only we would know. Some people might find it paranoid. We found it healing. 3 years after his sentencing, Julian filed for early parole. Victims have the right to make impact statements at parole hearings, and I struggled with whether to attend. Dr. Kim said it was my choice, that there was no wrong answer. Some people need closure through confrontation. Others need closure through absence. Only you know which you are. I ultimately decided to go, to speak, to ensure the parole board understood the full scope of damage Julian had caused. The hearing was in a medium security facility in Pennsylvania, a concrete building that smelled like industrial cleaner and desperation. Julian sat at a table with his lawyer, and when our eyes met across the room, I saw someone I barely recognized. He'd aged in prison, lines around his eyes, gray creeping into his hair at the temples. We were no longer identical. I gave my statement sitting at a table across from the parole board, 3 stern-faced individuals who held Julian's future in their hands. My brother didn't just steal money or access confidential files, I said, my voice steady. He stole my identity, my sense of self, my ability to trust my own perceptions. He stole my girlfriend's financial security and her mental health. He stole my parents' peace of mind and destroyed our family's foundation. He did all of this with premeditation, with planning, with absolute disregard for the devastation he was causing. I looked at Julian directly. I don't know if he's genuinely remorseful or if he's just sorry he got caught. I don't know if prison has changed him or if he's just learned to be a better actor. What I do know is that he took 8 months to plan his crime and 3 years to face some of its consequences. That's not enough time for the kind of fundamental character change required for redemption. The parole board asked me questions about whether I'd feel safe if Julian were released, whether I believed he posed a continued threat. I answered honestly, I didn't know. Julian had shown himself capable of sustained deception and complex criminal planning. He'd demonstrated a willingness to destroy people he supposedly loved in pursuit of his own goals. Could 3 years of model prisoner behavior erase that? I wasn't sure. The hearing ended with no immediate decision. The board would deliberate and notify all parties within 30 days. Julian's lawyer asked if I'd speak with Julian briefly before I left. I declined. We'd said everything that needed saying. He'd written his apology. I'd given my impact statement. Further conversation would just be picking at wounds that were finally starting to scar. Julian's parole was denied. The board cited insufficient time served relative to the severity and premeditation of his crimes. He'd be eligible to apply again in 2 years. I felt relief and guilt in equal measure. Relief that I wouldn't have to navigate having him in the world yet. Guilt that I felt relieved about my own brother remaining in prison. Doctor. Kim reminded me that both feelings were valid, that moral complexity was part of healing. You can acknowledge that prison is harsh and still believe someone needs to face consequences. You can grieve the brother you lost while accepting the danger the actual person poses. The paradoxes of trauma recovery were becoming familiar territory. I was learning to hold contradictory truths simultaneously. Julian was my brother and my victimizer. I was damaged and resilient. The past was unchangeable and I was constantly changing. 5 years after the original security footage showed me where I wasn't, I stood in a different office building, giving a different presentation. I was keynoting a cybersecurity conference in San Diego, presenting the Doppelganger Protocol to an audience of 500 security professionals and corporate executives. The technology had been adopted by 12 Fortune 500 companies and was being pilot tested by the Department of Homeland Security. I showed the original security footage that had started everything. Me walking into my office building at 11:43 p.m. when I was in Seattle and explained how behavioral biometrics would have immediately flagged the imposter. I said, from the stage. Quote, 107. The presentation got a standing ovation, and afterward, dozens of people approached with questions, with stories of their own identity theft experiences, with business cards and partnership proposals. One woman, a security consultant from Chicago, named Olivia Grant, pulled me aside. She said quietly. I thanked her, feeling the weight and worth of turning trauma into purpose. Julian had tried to steal my life. Instead, he'd given me a mission. Rebecca was waiting in the hotel room when I got back, having flown in to support me. We ordered room service and sat on the balcony watching the Pacific Ocean, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, complete peace. Not the absence of pain, the scars from Julian's betrayal would always be there, but the presence of acceptance. I'd been violated, yes. I'd lost relationships and security and innocence, but I'd also survived, rebuilt, and created something meaningful from the wreckage. Quote, 110. Rebecca said, taking my hand. Quote, 111. I squeezed her hand back, grateful for her presence, her patience, her willingness to love someone as complicated and scarred as I'd become. My parents watched the presentation online, and my mother called afterward, crying happy tears. You took something terrible and made it matter, she said. You helped people. That's what we hoped you'd do with your life, both of you boys. The mention of Julian was casual now, integrated rather than avoided. We'd learned to talk about him as both things, the son and brother we'd loved, and the criminal who'd betrayed us. He was serving his time, participating in programs, writing occasional letters I sometimes read and sometimes threw away unread. Maybe someday he'd get out, and we'd have to navigate what relationship, if any, was possible. But that was a future problem. Today's achievement was enough. 10 years after Julian first started planning my identity theft, I received notification that he was being released on parole. He'd served 7 years of his 8-year sentence, and the parole board had finally been convinced he'd sufficiently rehabilitated. The notification included his release address, a halfway house in Newark, and conditions of his parole, mandatory therapy, no contact with me or Claire without explicit written consent, regular check-ins with his parole officer, and restrictions on internet access. Dr. Kim and I spent several sessions preparing for the possibility of eventual contact, establishing my boundaries, planning my responses. You don't owe him anything, Dr. Kim reminded me. Not forgiveness, not a relationship, not even acknowledgement. Whatever you choose it for yourself, not for him. I chose limited acknowledgement. I sent a letter through his parole officer, brief and direct. I'm aware you've been released. I need you to respect my boundaries, which include no direct contact for the foreseeable future. I hope you're working to become a better person, but I'm not ready to be part of that journey. Respect this boundary, and we might eventually find a way forward. Violate it, and you'll never hear from me again. I didn't know if he'd honor it, but I'd set the line clearly. Rebecca supported the decision. My parents understood it, and Dr. Kim said it demonstrated healthy boundary setting. Whether Julian respected it would tell me everything I needed to know about whether he'd actually changed. A year passed with no contact. Then 2. Reports from his parole officer showed Julian working steadily at a warehouse job, attending therapy, living quietly. He'd started volunteering at a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated people find employment. His therapist's reports, which I received through the victim notification system, indicated genuine progress in understanding the harm he'd caused and developing healthier coping mechanisms. Part of me wanted to believe it. Part of me remembered how convincingly he'd lied before. Dr. Kim said both reactions were reasonable, that trust rebuilt slowly, if at all, and I should trust my gut about timing. Rebecca and I got married in a small ceremony with 40 guests, none of them Julian. My parents asked if we should invite him, send an announcement, something. I declined. This day was about building my future, not reconciling my past. We honeymooned in New Zealand, as far from Boston and family drama as we could get, hiking mountains and exploring caves, and remembering what it felt like to simply exist without the weight of history. On our last night, sitting in a hot spring under southern stars, Rebecca asked if I ever regretted how everything had unfolded. Sometimes, I admitted. I wonder what life would have been like if I'd just paid Julian off, avoided the confrontation, kept the peace. She considered that. You'd be poorer, probably still at a job you liked, maybe still with Claire. She paused. But you wouldn't have built the doppelganger protocol. You wouldn't have helped thousands of people protect their identities. You wouldn't be you, this version of you that survived and thrived. 3 years after his release, Julian requested a supervised meeting through our mutual therapist. Dr. Kim offered to facilitate, providing a neutral space with professional support. I agreed to one session, making clear it was exploratory, not committing to ongoing contact. The meeting was in Dr. Kim's office on a Wednesday afternoon. Julian arrived on time, dressed casually but neatly, and when I saw him, the shock of recognition was muted. We looked similar still, but age and experience had carved different maps on our identical faces. He'd gained weight in a healthy way, lost the gaunt desperation that had haunted his features during trial. He looked, for the first time in memory, like someone at peace with himself. "Thank you for agreeing to this," he said, his voice careful. We sat in chairs arranged in a loose triangle, Dr. Kim observing quietly. "I know I have no right to your time or forgiveness. I wanted to tell you in person what I've been working on." He'd written a memoir during his final years in prison, working with a therapist to process his choices and their consequences. It wasn't published. He'd signed over any potential proceeds to a victim's fund, but it was his attempt at accountability. "I want you to read it," he said, handing me a bound manuscript. "Not for my sake, but because I tried to be honest about what I did and why. If it helps you understand, then it served its purpose. If it doesn't, you can burn it. Either way, I owe you that honesty." I took the manuscript, heavy in my hands. "Why did you do it?" I asked, the question I'd been carrying for years. Quote, 126. He was quiet for a long moment. Quote, 127. He met my eyes. Quote, 128. Dr. Kim guided us through structured conversation, my impact statement, Julian's accountability, exploration of whether any kind of future relationship was possible or desirable. We didn't reach conclusions. We opened doors without walking through them. By the end of the 2-hour session, I felt exhausted but not traumatized. Julian felt real again, not as the brother I'd grown up with, and not as the criminal who'd victimized me, but as a flawed human trying to do better. Dr. Kim said that was progress. I agreed to read the manuscript and consider whether further contact might be possible. No promises, no timelines, no expectations, just the possibility of something other than complete estrangement. I read Julian's memoir over 2 weeks, processing the words between sessions with Dr. Kim. It was brutal in its honesty, detailing not just the crimes, but the distorted thinking that had justified them. He wrote about growing up in my shadow, feeling like a defective copy, about the slow accumulation of resentments that had calcified into hatred. The final chapter was titled Apology and Accountability, addressed directly to me. I cannot undo what I did. I cannot restore what I stole. But I can promise to spend the rest of my life trying to become someone worthy of the brother you deserved. I met with Julian 3 more times over the following year. Supervised sessions, structured conversations, gradual rebuilding of something that wasn't quite brotherly affection, but wasn't pure estrangement either. We established rules. He didn't ask about my life uninvited. I didn't weaponize his past. We both committed to honesty over comfort. It was awkward and painful and occasionally sparked old traumas, but it was also real in a way our relationship had never been before. We were seeing each other clearly for the first time, stripped of family mythology and competitive dynamics. Sometimes I almost liked the person he was becoming. Sometimes I remembered everything he'd done and wanted to walk away permanently. Dr. Kim said both reactions were valid, that relationships don't have to be all or nothing, that I could maintain limited contact without full reconciliation. 15 years after Julian first walked into my office building wearing my face, I gave another keynote presentation, this time at an international conference on identity and criminal justice in Geneva. The Doppelganger Protocol had become an industry standard, implemented in thousands of organizations worldwide. I'd published a book about identity theft and recovery, consulted with governments on security policy, and built a successful consulting firm specializing in post-breach identity restoration. My work had helped prevent countless cases of identity fraud and had assisted thousands of victims in rebuilding their lives. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of experts and advocates and survivors, I felt the full weight of transformation. Julian had tried to steal my identity. Instead, he'd given me the purpose that defined it. Rebecca and I had 2 children by then, twins, ironically, though fraternal rather than identical. Raising them, I thought often about the dynamics between Julian and me, about the subtle ways comparison and competition could poison sibling relationships. I was determined to raise my sons as individuals, to celebrate their differences rather than forcing them into parallel tracks. They would know about their uncle in age-appropriate ways, the cautionary tale of what happens when jealousy metastasizes into destruction, but they would also know about redemption, about the possibility of change, about grace without naive Tao C. Julian had limited supervised contact with Thema, uncle visits on birthdays, carefully monitored, never alone. My parents were grateful for that grace, for the acknowledgement that people could be both harmful and human, both guilty and growing. My mother died when the boys were 5, a sudden heart attack that gave us no time to prepare. The funeral brought our fractured family back together, me, Rebecca, the twins, my father, and Julian, on supervised parole release. We stood together at the grave, 5 generations of complicated family dynamics compressed into a single moment of shared grief. Julian stood slightly apart, respecting boundaries even in mourning, but his tears were genuine. After the service, he approached me carefully. "She never stopped loving me," he said quietly. "Even after everything, she wrote to me every month, visited when she could. I don't know if I deserved that." I thought about my mother's capacity for complicated love, her ability to hold both accountability and grace. Quote, 134. I said, quote, 135. My father lived another decade, long enough to see my boys graduate high school. In his final year, Dad asked Julian and me to meet him together. He was weak from cancer, his body failing, but his mind still sharp. He said, quote, 136, quote. He looked at both of us. We buried my father next to my mother, and Julian and I stood together at the grave for the first time without supervision, without structure, just 2 brothers mourning their imperfect parents. Julian asked. I considered the question. He nodded slowly. Quote 141. We stood in companionable silence, watching workers fill the grave, and I realized that this was as close to peace as we might get. Not reconciliation in any traditional sense, but acknowledgement of shared history and separate healing. We would never be close. but we were no longer enemies. That was something. 20 years after Julian first decided to steal my identity, I retired from active consulting to focus on teaching at MIT's Sloan School of Management, teaching courses on ethics, identity security, and organizational resilience. My students knew my story, and they asked hard questions about forgiveness, justice, and redemption. I tried to give honest answers, explaining that justice isn't always satisfying, forgiveness isn't always possible, and redemption is a process that never fully completes. Julian called me on my 60th birthday, the first unsupervised call between us in decades. We talked for 15 minutes about nothing important: weather, health, his work managing a nonprofit supporting formerly incarcerated people. At the end of the call, he said something that surprised me. "I'm grateful for what happened." I bristled. Grateful? For committing crimes that destroyed lives? He was quiet. Not grateful for the pain I caused, but grateful that I got caught, stopped, forced to confront who I was. If you hadn't gone to the police, if I'd succeeded in framing you, I'd have kept going. I'd have become a monster beyond redemption. You saved me by refusing to be my victim. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I simply acknowledged it. Maybe there was truth there. Maybe stopping him had been a gift, harsh and painful, but ultimately necessary. I'm 65 now, looking back on 40 years since Julian first walked into my office building wearing my face and my identity. The Doppelganger Protocol is taught in cybersecurity programs worldwide. My book is assigned reading in criminal justice courses. I've consulted with governments, testified before Congress, and helped thousands of identity theft victims rebuild their lives. Julian completed his parole 15 years ago and has lived quietly since, working in prisoner advocacy, never reoffending, slowly earning back trust he'd destroyed. We have limited contact, holidays sometimes, occasional calls, an awkward but genuine attempt at being family in whatever form that can take. Claire reached out last year, now a respected trauma therapist in Portland with a family of her own. We met for coffee like we had decades ago, both of us gray now, both of us survived and scarred. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Fighting back, pursuing justice, everything that followed?" I thought about the question seriously. My life had been harder because I'd refused to be Julian's victim. I'd lost relationships, career momentum, years of peace, but I'd also gained purpose, helped people, transformed trauma into meaning. "No," I said finally. "I regret what happened, but not how I responded. Julian tried to erase me. I refused to disappear. That choice defined everything that came after." Rebecca and I are planning our retirement, talking about where to spend our final decades. The twins are building their own lives, successful in their own ways, blessedly free from the competitive dynamics that had poisoned Julian's and my relationship. They know their uncle as the cautionary tale who became the redemption story, the man who made terrible choices and spent his life making amends. It's not a simple narrative, but it's honest. My life's work has been about identity, protecting it, verifying it, helping people rebuild it when it's stolen. Julian stole mine 20 years ago, but in a strange way, he also gave it to me. The person I became in response to his crimes, the work I've done, the people I've helped. None of that would have existed without the violation. I don't thank him for it. But I acknowledge that trauma and growth can be impossibly, painfully intertwined. I saw Julian last month at a family reunion, the first time we'd been in the same room with extended family since before his arrest. Cousins whispered, unsure how to navigate the awkwardness of having both of us present. But we managed to exist in the same space without crisis or conflict, just two old men who happened to share DNA and a complicated history. Near the end of the gathering, he approached me hesitantly. He said. I nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without fully embracing it. Quote 151. Standing here now at 65, looking back on a life shaped by betrayal and justice and complicated healing, I realize the story doesn't have a clean ending. Julian didn't become a monster beyond redemption, and I didn't become a bitter victim. We both survived, changed, grew in directions neither of us expected. The identity theft that started everything became the foundation of my life's work. The brother who tried to erase me became someone capable of genuine change, even if our relationship would never be what it might have been. Justice was served, lives were rebuilt, and somehow, impossibly, we found a way forward that honored both accountability and grace. My identical twin pretended to be me for 6 months, and I spent 20 years learning why, because he saw me as everything he wasn't, until he learned to become something I could never be, someone who'd faced their worst self and chosen better. That's not forgiveness. That's not reconciliation. That's just the truth, complicated and scarred and real. And that, finally, is enough. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.